My name is Ashley Guardado. I work with the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, and I am so honored to be in conversation with you today. If you could, please kindly introduce yourself and your organization, the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network.
Well, thank you for joining me today, and for everyone who's listening. My name is Osprey Orielle Lake, and I'm the founder and executive director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network. And our organization started just as a little seedling in 2009. And it was at a time when it's not that there wasn't really attention around the nexus between gender and women and the climate crisis, but it was very small. And now there's much more of an international discourse on this topic, but it's actually really critical. And before I go into a lot of the reasons why, I thought it would be really good for people to see some of the work we do in action, just so you get a sense of what our network is doing, and get a sense of the amazing women that we work with all over the world.
How will the future generation look back on us? Are they going to say that we were the healers? We were the warriors that stood up for them so that they may live.
In this time of colliding crises and failing infrastructures, worsening climate disasters, I do believe we have a time to act, to ensure a fast, fair, and equitable phase-out, and ensure a planet for current and future generations.
A recent report by the UN Environment Program found that governments still plan to produce more than double the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 than what would be consistent with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. Since the signing of the Paris Agreement, the world's 60 largest private banks have provided $5.5 trillion in financing to the fossil fuel industry. We cannot continue with these disastrous numbers.
The fossil fuel industry has hurt us for far too long, both in the terms of emissions, but also causing a lot of wars and militarization.
And when we talk about the impacts of oil and gas and why we need a phase out of oil and gas all across the globe, is because this is not just about the reduction of emissions at source. This is also about the reductions of the harms and the violence Indigenous peoples have felt on our lands and our bodies and our communities.
It's crystal clear. We need a concrete, binding plan to end the expansion of new coal, oil, and gas projects and manage a transition away from fossil fuels. Nation states are now calling for a fossil fuel treaty, an equitable and wind-down plan for how to manage the wind-down in a way that leaves no country or community behind.
Kick polluters out! Kick polluters out! Kick polluters out! Kick polluters out! No climate justice without human rights! No climate justice without human rights! No climate justice without human rights!
Nós, mulheres, precisamos continuar avançando juntas. E juntas estamos aqui também para apresentar soluções.
Whether it's on the front lines of resistance to fossil fuels, protecting and replanting forests, creating food sovereignty networks, or advocating for transformative climate policies, women are leading the way. It is code red for humanity, and we're drawing a red line to say no more to sacrifice people and no more to sacrifice zones.
We need to decolonize these spaces because, if the planet is still alive, it's because we, the women, are taking care of our lands.
The message is quite clear. Feminists, frontline activists, frontline women, Indigenous people have long had the solutions, are advocating for these year in, year out, and it is time we heed to their leadership because we have long run out of time.
E viemos fazer clamor. Não há possibilidade de barrar as mudanças climáticas sem considerar os territórios como solução número 1. Pela terra, pelas águas, pela floresta de pé, não podemos derramar sangue indígena no chão.
We're enacting things in the Ponca territory like the rights of nature because we know that we as human beings are not separate from nature. But at this moment, we are nature protecting itself.
for showing that video. As was demonstrated, women globally are leading the way right now. Could you please share further why women are unique and key leaders to the solutions of the climate and biodiversity crisis?
So, as I was mentioning, when I first started the organization, one of the things that was very important to me is to understand where there were leverage points, where were there nodes that would create real impact. And after a lot of research, I found that not only due to gender inequality were women being most impacted by the climate crisis due to the fact of unequal economies, the way women are living in patriarchal societies all over the world. It impacts even things like if they are taught to swim or not in a disaster. Their capacity to have food security as they're trying to care for their families. All of these things deeply impact women who are on the front lines often of these crises. But there was an untold story that I really started to uncover, over a decade ago around the role that women are actually playing in leadership. And I want to just give some examples because we actually can't get to sustainability or a thriving future without women's leadership. And I would also add gender diverse leaders because I think it's important in our discourse to not remain in binaries. So one of the studies that we actually presented at the Scenarios Forum, which is a body that feeds the IPCC reports, is a really powerful study that shows that with just a 1 unit increase in something called the Women's Political Empowerment Index, which shows things country by country, like how much women are involved in social change, what is their economic structure, are they involved in politics, all of the different components of how women relate to their society and are empowered or not, is the Women's Political Empowerment Index. And with just a 1 unit increase, we've seen all over the world an 11.51% decrease in carbon emissions, which is extremely significant. It's very difficult to find things that lead up to that much decrease in carbon emission reductions. And so this is just one indicator, and certainly the climate crisis and moving to ensure that we have the least harms that could happen because of this crisis are not only about carbon emission reductions. No, but it is certainly an indicator I think that we need to look at. When we look at the global south and who is producing the most food, 40 to 80% of all household food production in developing countries is done by women. So when we're talking about food, women are key. Many UN studies have shown that if you don't involve women in water programs, they simply don't work because women are doing the water collection. They're caring for their families. They're caring for sanitation in their homes. They are the ones monitoring the water tables. So all of this to say that whether we're looking at the grassroots level or at the highest levels of government, if you don't engage women in decision-making and involve them in every aspect of these multiple crises that we're facing, we're not going to get to where we need to go. I would also mention that I think it's really important to understand within this context that we cannot leave out a racial lens. So also when we're talking about the most impacts, as well as some of the most innovative solutions, we're often talking about Indigenous, Black and Brown women. And I really want to uplift their voices because I think it's critical to this discourse on gender, which always, for us, needs to have a racial lens.
Thank you so much for sharing that truly critical information, analysis, and perspective. It sounds like we're really talking about a need for system change. So could you share further about what that means to you and how this influences WECAN's campaigns, programs, and advocacy? And if you could share examples within your organization of climate justice programs and projects.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has been really key to our organizing at WECAN is having both a short-term and long-term view on how to address what many scholars are calling a polycrisis, meaning a crisis in economy, the environment, a crisis in terms of race, a crisis in terms of colonization, a crisis in terms of governance. We're not looking at just one crisis. And the reason for that is that we have been living in oppressive systems for a very, very long time, and we're now living in the result of those crises. And to be very explicit, I'm talking about the result of colonization, racism, patriarchy, and economic systems that are based on extractivism. So right now we're talking about especially capitalism. And all of these systems are interwoven. They also lead to militarization. They also lead to imperialism. And so we have to sort of have the systemic approach if we want to have long-term results for the world and to ensure that everyone is equally lifted in the transformations that we're wanting to see in terms of improving how we're living with each other and the earth. And so I think it's really critical to understand we have to unpack these things and look at root causes, which means a systemic analysis. It means looking at our worldviews. It means looking at our different ideologies. All of this is key to resolving the crisis. So why I say this is as an example, let's say I could wave a magical wand and end the climate crisis tomorrow. The fact is we would still have environmental racism. We would still have colonization. We would still have capitalism, which are at the root of how we got into these crises in the first place. We need a complete radicalization of our politics, of our environmental laws, and our social structures. And this is what not only nature is telling us through droughts and floods and all the things we're seeing around climate chaos, but the uprise of so many people around the world against the corporate powers, against the powers of wealth, the wealthy elite. We're seeing this economically, socially, ecologically. We are in a huge transformation on Earth right now. And the more boldly we can look at systemic change, the more we're going to be able to have the healthy and just and equal societies that so many of us long for and are working for. So this is sort of like the long-term view of how we need to look at a systemic approach, or we'll just keep repeating these negative patterns that are so detrimental to so many people and to the land. In terms of the actual programs, like how do we actually take those sorts of ideas and implement them into our programs that we can and implement them into the coalitions we're working with? That is where our creative thinking and our openness to take on big ideas is really important. And then how do we define them into the nuances? So just to give an example of some of our programming, I'm thinking right now of work that we've done on the front lines coming out of Standing Rock. We were very engaged in that fight. We were camped out at Standing Rock for different periods of time to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline. And when we were there, we were very honored to be asked by a Dene human rights attorney, Michelle Cook, to work with her on developing these divestment delegations to bring Indigenous women to banks that were funding the Dakota Access Pipeline. And we did spend, months, and it ended up being over a year-long campaign, some of it going to some of the key banks in Europe, in Norway, Switzerland, and Germany, bringing Indigenous women from the front lines to directly meet with the banks and demand divestment from the Dakota Access Pipeline because of Indigenous rights violation, human rights violations, and also harms to the water and to the land, and obviously also to continuing to fuel the climate crisis through developing more fossil fuel pipelines. And it was a very successful campaign. Obviously, the Dakota Access Pipeline is still running. We're still engaged in that fight. In fact, we're engaged right now in supporting Indigenous-led movements right now to continue to do everything we can to stop this illegally running pipeline. But we were able to get major divestments and have different conversations about changing policies at the banks around Indigenous rights through this advocacy work. And so again, it was bringing a much deeper systems analysis to the banks around a rights-based approach to policy, a rights-based approach to investments. And so this is the kind of work I think is really important, where we bring frontline communities, those impacted first and worst, to situations where they can talk to the powers that be and people making decisions about their communities, whether it's the financial institutions or governments. As we saw in the film, It's primarily a video that shows our work at the climate talks. The film was based on a lot of footage that was collected at the climate talks in Dubai. And so I think it's also important, as we do every year, to bring frontline women from different parts of the world to directly speak to governments about concerns that are happening in their communities, so that we can ensure that when governments are talking about a just transition, we are at the table and not on the menu, so to speak, of what that discourse is and how we can even define what a just transition is. I think it's really important to understand right now that a lot of terminology can be co-opted, whether we're talking about a just transition or net zero or some of these other ideas that we know we need to move forward to navigate our way through the climate crisis. It's so essential that climate justice movements, frontline leaders have the opportunity to have interventions and share their analysis, or that sector will be completely co-opted again, by the wealthy elite who want to continue business as usual. So we've put out a lot of research and reports about this to inform people and continue to do direct advocacy as well as direct action on the streets, including, nonviolent direct action, whether it's at government agencies or with financial institutions, and really having a holistic approach to how we can really get on the ground and move forward our agenda for climate justice.
Thank you so much for sharing those many examples of WECAN's work, and also for helping us to define and hold climate justice principles and strategies. That's all really empowering to learn. As we look at broader movements for change, what are your thoughts on how we can stay connected in this time of interlocking crisis, and how can we find common ground and offer mutual support to build momentum in this movement alongside other movements for change?
Well, I think one of the things that's happening, not just at WECAN, but in climate justice movements globally, is that it's become very clear that everything is tied together. So this is why earlier on we were talking about a systemic analysis. How do we actually get off of extractive economy, which is driving, the extraction of fossil fuels, and how can we incorporate a labor lens, a gender lens, a racial lens to our movements, which means everyone has to be at the table. We're going to be stronger when we have coalitions that include workers' rights, Indigenous rights, gender rights. All of these things are interwoven when we're looking at transforming systems of oppression. And so I think one of the things that has really been strengthened in our movements and needs to continue is, as many people say, we cannot keep operating in our silos. We have to work together. And we're up against terrific odds, which means not only do we need more of us, but we also need to see how all of our struggles are really intertwined, which is, of course, what people have been calling an intersectional lens, which is essential. I would also add that I think it's really important to make sure that, as I was mentioning earlier, that we center frontline voices and ensure that that leadership is uplifted. I think it's also really important that we have spaces that are our own, so we can define what we mean by a just transition, so we can define what we mean by a healthy and equitable world, that we have spaces where we can envision and strategize together the world that we want. So that's like one space that's really important to organize in. And then also having these other spaces where we're having interventions with those who have power in our current context. And I think we have to have a double strategy in that way, because both are really essential. In other words, how do we dismantle the structures that are so dangerous to our communities and to the earth, while we simultaneously are building the world that we want? And maybe I'll just give an example of a project I'm really excited about, is in the Democratic Republic of Congo. WECAN has been working there for over 8 years now with a wonderful coordinator. Our WECAN coordinator there is Nima Namadamu, a Congolese woman, incredible powerhouse. And what we have been doing for I guess a little bit over 8 years now is initiating a project in which we are reforesting very, very damaged lands in the Tombe rainforest in the DR Congo. And as some people might know, one of the very important strategies as we look at climate mitigations is the protection of forests. The Amazon rainforest is actually very critical, and people are aware of why it's so important to our ecological systems. But when we look at the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Congo Basin overall, it's the second largest forest that we need to protect. And then, of course, we need to look at the boreal forests and the Indonesian forests. But we are focusing on this really powerful project in the DR Congo, where over 1,000 women now are engaged in reforestation. And it's been really thrilling because we've seen so much progress in this program, in that 25% of the trees that we're growing are for human use, and 75% are growing, rewilding the forest that was once there. And years later, what we're seeing is we're almost to the point where we've grown enough trees that the populations there can use, that they're no longer going to the old growth forest, which is what we really need to protect, the old growth natural forest. And we're protecting 1.6 million acres of old growth forest as the community uses the 25% of the trees that we've grown, while we're reforesting 75% of the forest to rewild itself. And one of the unexpected things that happened just in the last year and a half or 2 years, which happened much faster than the foresters and scientists thought, is that nature is revitalizing herself, because as you grow trees, moisture is brought into the land, it seeds the rains, and now there's all these what we're calling wild nurseries popping up, which of course is the best, because nature knows best how to reforest herself. And so in addition to our nurseries, now there are all these wild nurseries that we're protecting, and the land is quickly rejuvenating itself. And I think it's so inspiring to see that if we move towards nature, how fast nature will work with us, and how we can redefine ourselves as a life-enhancing species, I think is really critical at this time, because we have so many examples of how we're harming the earth and harming nature. But actually, how do we change that narrative and change our activities to be life-enhancing? And so it's a project I'm really excited about, and it goes hand in hand in other areas where we are reforesting, including in the Amazon, and how this also leads to food security, because once we have these nurseries growing to grow trees, it really is a simple step to also start generating food for communities and developing food security and food sovereignty as we also grow trees, which is going to be critical in the times ahead, that communities are able to feed themselves and be able to have water and food and medicines that they grow. So it's been very, very exciting to see the development of this project. And the last piece I will say on this is also there's a gender aspect, because right now the DR Congo is a conflict zone because of the extractive economy. And women have not been safe there. It's not been safe for them to travel and go into the forest. And as we grow trees that are local to their community, there's been much less violence and violations against the women. And also, it's as our partners there tell us, it's also been very empowering for the women, and how much more of a role of leadership they have in their communities, because they are leading this reforestation program. They are changing the economy. They are changing the productivity and care for their communities. And so it's been very exciting also to see the social change that has occurred with this women-led reforestation project.
Thank you. I agree. Thank you for highlighting these many imperatives and ways that you can, as you shared, dismantle these various oppressive structures that be. And of course, for sharing more about overhauling our connection to nature and that amazing example of WECAN's work in the DR Congo. That leads me to my final question. Can you share some of the most promising initiatives that WECAN is involved with and excited about?
Yeah, there's several that, in addition to our programs, that I think are really important projects, but also initiatives for political change. So right now, I'm thinking of the Fossil Free Non-Proliferation Treaty. WECAN sits on the steering committee of the treaty. And what this treaty is a parallel mechanism, you could say, to the Paris Climate Agreement, We were very engaged and continue to be very engaged in the climate negotiations, and they have their place and role because it's where governments have agreed with the Paris Climate Agreement. And so it's a very valuable and important mechanism that we need to continue to track and push governments to do more. And we're very thankful for the 1.5 degree guardrail that was established in the Paris Climate Agreement because it's given us a lot of leverage in our advocacy and a way to hold financial institutions and governments accountable. However, the Paris Climate Agreement does not really address the supply end of the problem of the climate crisis. And so we're really honored to work with the Fossil Free Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was initiated by a powerful woman, Zipporah Berman. And basically, it's a mechanism for governments to negotiate how to end fossil fuels, modeled off of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So we know that those kind of treaties can work. There's precedent for it. And it's been very exciting because there has been gaining momentum around this Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And something that comes to mind is when we were in Dubai, there was a really powerful side event in which the president of Colombia endorsed the treaty. And it was very moving because there have been island nations, which is fantastic, who've been leading out on endorsing the treaty, but to actually see a fossil fuel producing country like Colombia sign on to endorse the treaty was very inspiring and really shows the momentum and possibility of this treaty. Another area that I'm very excited about is our work with rights of nature. I have been on the executive committee for the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature for over a decade. And this work involves really addressing how we can shift our legal system and basically change the DNA of our legal system so that we stop treating nature as property, which is a key problem. We have so many environmental laws around the world, but clearly they're not working, or we would not be in an environmental and climate crisis. And so what is it about these environmental laws that are not working? And in part, it has to do with the fact of continuing to see the commodification and financialization of nature and putting nature into the marketplace. In other words, seeing the economy as more important than ecological systems, which means we continue to break planetary boundaries. And so how do we actually have a legal system that says rivers and forests and mountains and the climate itself has rights, the right to thrive and be healthy and have a full healthy system? And so it's a different form of earth jurisprudence that says that nature rights should be equal to human rights. And there's various forms of rights of nature. And a key document for those who might be interested is something called the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth, which came out of a big conference in Cochabamba in 2010, which is a legal framework that was established by many scholars and indigenous peoples from all over the world. And one of the things that I think is really important to know about rights of nature, it's not just an idea, it is actually being implemented. In 2008, Ecuador became the first country in the world to put rights of nature into their constitution. And there now have been several legal cases, one on a rights of nature basis. There are now 39 countries that are engaged in rights of nature work or have actually passed rights of nature laws in their countries. And the UN Secretary General at the end of last year actually said it's one of the fastest growing earth jurisprudence movements in the world, which rights of nature is a part of. So I think it's very promising. In the United States, there have been local ordinances changed to implement rights of nature to protect communities from fracking and protecting water. Just recently, there was an award given at the Goldman Environmental Awards this year to a powerful woman from Spain who was able to use rights of nature legislation in Spain to protect a river. All this to say that it is an incredibly powerful movement that's gaining momentum. And what I really love about it is that it actually puts the earth in the center of the conversation. And there are also components of it that lift up land defenders, which is also a really important topic, which will lead me to my next comment, which is we've been very engaged in something called the Escazú Agreement, which applies to the Latin American Caribbean region, which is a legally binding agreement, multilateral agreement in the Latin American Caribbean region that combines environmental laws and human rights laws. So it's quite unique and special in the understanding that, one, people have to have access to environmental laws, but they also need to be protected in land defense. And so this has been very important to us. We've done a lot of work at WECAN to particularly work with women land defenders in Latin America because they're some of the most threatened, as Global Witness has reported annually. The killings of land defenders is very, very serious. Those protecting the forests, those protecting the waterways. And so we really must stand up and defend the defenders of the land. And I think the Escazú Agreement is potentially a very powerful government mechanism and governance mechanism that we can use to protect land defenders in their work and to make sure they have access to environmental information so that they know what is happening in their territories and their lands. And we've been big proponents of it. We've advocated for it. We helped push it through to become actually a legally binding agreement. And now we're working on toolkits for grassroots women leaders to be able to understand what this agreement means to them and how they can utilize it and also have access to pro bono attorneys to help them if they're being threatened. I think I'll just mention one last thing to close this, which is I want to make sure people have access to a lot of the research that we've done at WECAN. On our website, we have a page dedicated to why women, so people can understand the stats. I only gave a few, but I think it's really important for people to understand not only ethically and morally is it correct that we should have egalitarian societies and lift up the role of women and gender diverse leaders, but also showing the statistics about the fact about how and why women are leading and that it's actually critical to all of our survival. And we also have on our website a link to something called Women Speak, which we have developed over many years, which is a storytelling database that shares literally thousands of stories by and about women leaders in 14 different category areas, everything from women in climate policy to women in forests and women in water and women in food security and Indigenous rights. And so we can really see the full array of the incredible work that women leaders are doing and learn about their stories and lift up their voices in this Women Speak database. And I would really encourage people to go there so that we have both the qualitative and quantitative analysis about the role of women's leadership and why it's essential that we support, fund, empower women in this role. And it's also important to say that it's not about putting men down, but about lifting women up so that we have all of our voices being heard in this incredible moment of transformation for humanity.
Well, it's been great to hear from you and to learn more about the work of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you so much.